Master discipline to the point it intimidates. Lessons from Machiavelli. The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others. In the cold morning mist of Florence, 1513, Niccolo Machiavelli sat in his modest villa, stripped of political power, exiled from the corridors where he once walked as secretary of the Florentine Republic. His hands, once accustomed to signing treaties and commanding respect, now held only a quill. Yet in this apparent defeat, he was crafting what would become one of history's most enduring treatises on power, The Prince. What emerged from his pen that winter was not merely political theory, but a profound meditation on the nature of discipline, self-mastery, and the transformation of weakness into intimidating strength. The document you hold before you is not simply another analysis of Machiavellian thought. It is a blueprint for personal transformation, drawn from the same well of insight that produced The Prince, but focused inward, on the conquest of the self. For Machiavelli understood a fundamental truth that resonates across centuries. Before one can master others, one must first master oneself. Before one can inspire fear in enemies, one must first destroy the enemy within. Consider the man who would later pen the words, "It is better to be feared than loved." A man who had lost everything, yet emerged more formidable than ever. Machiavelli's exile was not his destruction. It was his forge. In losing external power, he discovered the only power that truly matters, the power over oneself. This is the first lesson in intimidating discipline. That true strength is born not from dominance over others, but from the complete annihilation of one's own weaknesses. The weak man fears discipline because he sees it as limitation. The strong man embraces discipline because he recognizes it as liberation. When Machiavelli wrote of the lion and the fox, the dual nature required for effective leadership, he was describing more than political strategy. He was outlining the psychological transformation necessary for anyone who would transcend mediocrity. The lion represents raw strength and courage, the willingness to face any challenge head-on. The fox represents cunning and intelligence, the ability to navigate complexity with grace, but both required discipline to manifest. In the courts of Renaissance Italy, Machiavelli observed princes who fell not because of external enemies, but because they could not conquer their own impulses. He watched as men of great potential destroyed themselves through lack of self-control, through indulgence in pleasure when they should have been preparing for war, through emotional decisions when calculation was required. These observations formed the foundation of his understanding. The man who cannot master himself will inevitably be mastered by others. The intimidating nature of true discipline lies not in its harshness but in its completeness. When a man has systematically eliminated every weakness within himself, when he has transformed every impulse into a tool of his will, when he has made himself invulnerable through self-mastery, he becomes a force that others instinctively recognize and fear. This is not the crude intimidation of the bully, which is born of insecurity and ultimately fragile. This is the profound intimidation of absolute competence, of a will that has been tested in the crucible of self-discipline and emerged unbreakable. Part 1. The Architecture of Self-Destruction. The greatest enemy you will ever face looks back at you from the mirror each morning. This enemy knows your every weakness, your every fear, your every moment of doubt. This enemy has intimate access to your thoughts, can sabotage your efforts from within, and has a perfect record of exploiting your vulnerabilities at the worst possible moments. This enemy is your weak self, and until you destroy it completely, you will remain vulnerable to every external threat. Machiavelli understood this with crystalline clarity. In his correspondence with Francesco Vittori, he wrote of his daily routine in exile, rising before dawn, reading the classics, walking his lands, and in the evening donning his finest clothes to commune with the great minds of antiquity through their books. This was not mere habit, it was warfare. Each disciplined action was a blow struck against the man he used to be. The man who had allowed himself to be outmaneuvered politically. The man who had trusted when he should have calculated. The architecture of self-destruction. The systematic dismantling of weakness requires first a brutal inventory of what must be eliminated. Machiavelli's advice to princes was always to assess their territories honestly, identifying every vulnerability before their enemies could exploit them. The same principle applies to the self. You must catalogue every weakness with the dispassionate eye of a military strategist surveying a battlefield. Begin with your immediate impulses, those first reactions that arise unbidden when you face challenge or opportunity. The weak man's impulse is always toward comfort, toward the easy path. toward immediate gratification. Watch these impulses arise and recognize them as enemies to be eliminated. When faced with a difficult task, notice the mind's immediate search for excuses, for delays, for reasons why the task can be postponed or avoided entirely. This is the voice of your weak self, and it must be silenced not through suppression but through replacement. A weak self thrives on inconsistency, on the gaps between your stated intentions and your actual actions. It feeds on the energy of internal conflict, growing stronger each time you fail to keep a commitment to yourself. Machiavelli observed that a prince who makes promises he cannot keep soon finds his word carries no weight. The same is true of the promises you make to yourself. Every broken commitment to your own improvement is a victory for weakness, a crack in the foundation of your character. Consider the power of the written word in self-destruction. Machiavelli wrote The Prince not merely to advise others, but to crystallize his own understanding of power and its proper use. The act of writing forced him to confront his own failures, to analyze them with the same cold precision he applied to the failures of the princes he studied. When you commit your weaknesses to paper, when you document your failures and analyze them without mercy or self-deception, you begin the process of transformation. The weak self abhors accountability. It prefers the comfortable ambiguity of unexamined life, where failures can be attributed to circumstances, to other people, to anything except the inadequacy of will and preparation. True self-destruction begins with the acceptance of absolute responsibility. Machiavelli never blamed his exile on the Medici family's return to power or the changing political winds of Italy. He examined his own actions, his own failures of calculation and preparation. This acceptance of responsibility was not self-flagellation. It was the first step toward ensuring such failures would never happen again. The demolition of weakness requires tools, and the primary tool is daily practice. Not practice toward some distant goal, but practice in the immediate destruction of weak impulses as they arise. When the alarm sounds at dawn and every fiber of your being calls for more sleep, the conscious choice to rise is a blow struck against weakness. When hunger calls for indulgence and you choose precise nutrition instead, you are waging war against the undisciplined self. When anger rises and you respond with calculation rather than emotion, you are destroying the reactive patterns that have kept you weak. Machiavelli's concept of virtue, often translated as virtue but meaning something closer to effective action or practical wisdom, is built on this foundation of destroyed weakness. Virtue cannot coexist with self-indulgence, with emotional reactivity, with the comfortable habits that keep men mediocre. It emerges only when the weak self has been so thoroughly dismantled that what remains is pure will, aligned with clear purpose and unencumbered by internal contradiction. The process is neither quick nor comfortable. Machiavelli spent his exile in what he called poverty, exile, and disgrace, yet he emerged from this period with insights that would influence human thought for centuries. Your own process of self-destruction may not involve external exile, but it requires internal separation from everything that has kept you weak. This means abandoning not just bad habits, but comfortable mediocrity in all its forms. The weak self is cunning in its own way. It will attempt to bargain, to negotiate exceptions, to preserve small territories where indiscipline can flourish under the guise of balance or humanity. Recognize these negotiations for what they are: attempts by weakness to preserve itself. The intimidating discipline we seek requires no such negotiations. It demands complete surrender from the weak self, total capitulation, unconditional annihilation. There is a moment in every serious practitioner's journey when the weak self makes its final, desperate stand. This moment often comes disguised as wisdom, as the reasonable voice suggesting that perhaps you have gone too far, that such rigid discipline is itself a weakness, that truly strong people are more flexible. This is the death rattle of mediocrity. Push through this moment without compromise and you will find on the other side something magnificent. A self so aligned, so disciplined, so completely integrated that it becomes intimidating in its very presence. The man who has successfully destroyed his weak self does not need to announce his strength or prove his discipline to others. His very being radiates the unmistakable energy of someone who has conquered himself. Others sense this immediately, often without understanding why. They find themselves speaking more carefully around such a person, thinking twice before challenging him, instinctively recognizing that they are in the presence of someone who operates from a different level of personal power. This is the first foundation of intimidating discipline, the complete destruction of internal weakness. Only when this work is done can the real construction begin. the building of a self so formidable that others recognize its strength instinctively and respond accordingly. Part 2. The forging of intimidating will. From the ashes of destroyed weakness emerges something far more potent than mere strength. It is will forged in the fire of absolute discipline, tempered by relentless practice, and sharpened to a point that cuts through resistance like a blade through silk. This is not the brittle willpower that breaks under pressure, but the intimidating will that bends reality to its purpose. Machiavelli understood that true power lies not in commanding others, but in commanding oneself so completely that others naturally fall into alignment. In his observations of Cesare Borgia, the prince who came closest to his ideal, he noted how Borgia's presence alone could shift the dynamics of a room. Men who had never met him would speak in hushed tones when he entered, not because of his reputation for violence, but because of something more fundamental: the unmistakable aura of a man whose will had been forged into an unbreakable instrument. The forging process begins with the establishment of non-negotiable standards. These are not goals to be achieved someday, but immediate requirements that define your existence. When Machiavelli established his daily routine in exile, it was not a schedule he followed when convenient. It was the architecture of his days, as fundamental and unchanging as the sunrise. Your non-negotiable standards become the anvil upon which your will is hammered into shape. Consider the difference between preference and principle. The weak man operates from preference. He does what feels good, what is convenient, what aligns with his momentary desires. The intimidating will operates from principle, immutable laws of personal conduct that remain constant regardless of mood, circumstance, or external pressure. These principles are few but absolute. They become the bedrock upon which all action is built. The development of intimidating will requires what Machiavelli called the long view, the ability to sacrifice immediate comfort for ultimate objectives. But this is not mere delayed gratification. It is the transformation of sacrifice into strength. Each time you choose the difficult path when an easy alternative exists, each time you maintain your standards when circumstances provide convenient excuses for their abandonment, you are not merely resisting temptation, you are forging will into a more perfect instrument. The forge requires heat, and heat comes from resistance. Machiavelli observed that the strongest princes were those who had faced the greatest challenges, who had been forced to develop their capacities under extreme pressure. Your will is strengthened not by avoiding difficulty, but by seeking it out, by deliberately placing yourself in situations that test your resolve and force your discipline to evolve. This is where most men fail. They develop a certain level of discipline and then seek to maintain it in comfort. They create environments that support their habits and remove temptations, believing this to be wisdom. But intimidating will is not built in the greenhouse of comfortable circumstances. It is forged in the crucible of challenge. Seek out situations that stress your discipline. Put yourself in environments where maintaining your standards requires genuine effort. This is how will develops the quality that intimidates: unshakable reliability under pressure. The intimidating will possesses a quality that Machiavelli prized above all others: predictability in principle, unpredictability in tactics. Others learned that your fundamental commitments are absolute. They can count on your word, trust in your consistency, rely on your standards never wavering. But they cannot predict exactly how you will respond to any given situation because your tactics are calibrated to effectiveness, not to comfort or convention. This creates a powerful dynamic. People around you begin to recognize that while they cannot manipulate you through your weaknesses because you have destroyed them, neither can they predict your responses based on social conventions or emotional reactions. You become someone who must be taken seriously, whose judgment carries weight, whose approval has value precisely because it cannot be easily obtained. The forging process involves daily tests that most people never impose upon themselves. When the commitment is to rise at 5 a.m., the intimidating will rises at 4:59. When the standard is an hour of focused work, it produces 61 minutes. When the principle is complete honesty, every word is weighed for its truth. This precision, this refusal to accept close enough, gradually transforms the will into an instrument of intimidating effectiveness. Machiavelli's famous advice that the end justifies the means is often misunderstood as an endorsement of unethical behavior. In reality, it reflects a deeper understanding. that a man whose ends are worthy and whose will is properly forged can employ any necessary means because his discipline ensures they will be employed with precision and proportion. The intimidating will does not need to be cruel, but it must be capable of cruelty when circumstances demand it. It does not need to be harsh, but it must be capable of absolute firmness when principles are at stake. The transformation of will from merely personal discipline to intimidating force occurs when others begin to sense that you are operating from a different paradigm entirely. They recognize that you are not simply following rules or trying to be disciplined, you have become discipline itself. Your actions flow from a source they cannot quite understand, but instinctively respect. This respect manifests in subtle but unmistakable ways. Conversations pause when you speak. People seek your opinion on matters where your expertise is not obvious. Others begin to hold themselves to higher standards in your presence without being asked. These are the signs that your will has achieved the quality that intimidates not through fear, but through excellence so complete it makes mediocrity uncomfortable. The intimidating will develops what Machiavelli called necessary harshness, not cruelty for its own sake, but the capacity for absolute firmness when principles are at stake. This harshness is first applied to yourself, in the relentless maintenance of your standards, and only then, when absolutely necessary, applied to others. But because others have witnessed your harshness toward yourself, they understand that any harshness directed at them comes from principle, not from weakness or emotional reaction. The final characteristic of truly intimidating will is its economy of force. The man whose will has been properly forged rarely needs to demonstrate its power. A word is sufficient where others might require threats. A look can accomplish what others attempt through elaborate arguments. This efficiency of influence comes not from technique or manipulation, but from the recognition others have that they are dealing with someone whose will has been tested and found unbreakable. The intimidating will, once forged, becomes self-reinforcing. Each successful application of disciplined choice strengthens the capacity for future discipline. Each principled stand, regardless of its immediate cost, adds to the reputation for reliability that makes future stands more effective. Each moment of choosing difficulty over comfort adds to the reservoir of strength that makes future difficulties seem manageable. This is the second pillar of intimidating discipline. Will forged to such perfection that it becomes a force others instinctively recognize and respect. Combined with the destroyed weakness of the first pillar, it creates a foundation for the final element, the construction of unassailable character. Part 3. The unassailable fortress of character. Character is the fortress that protects all other achievements, like the great fortresses of Renaissance Italy that Machiavelli studied, Castel Sant'Angelo, the Fortezza da Basso. True character is built not for show but for siege. It must withstand assault from every direction. The attacks of envious men, the pressures of circumstance, the subtle erosions of time and comfort, and most dangerously, the betrayals that come from within. The man who has built his character into an unassailable fortress becomes something that others approach with natural deference, for they sense immediately that they are in the presence of someone who cannot be broken. Machiavelli spent considerable time studying the great fortresses of his era, understanding that military architecture reflected deeper principles of strength and vulnerability. The same principles that made a castle impregnable could make a man invincible. The strongest fortresses were not those with the highest walls, but those with no weaknesses that enemies could exploit. Character follows the same rule. Its strength lies not in any single virtue, but in the absence of exploitable flaws. The construction of unassailable character begins with the recognition that character is not what you display in public, but what you maintain in private. Machiavelli's evening ritual in exile, dressing in his finest clothes to read the classics, treating his solitary study as if he were entering the presence of greatness, was an act of character building. He understood that who you are when no one is watching is who you truly are. The intimidating presence you seek to develop must be authentic at its core, for any false element will eventually be detected and exploited. The foundations of this fortress are laid in the small moments when no one is paying attention. The way you treat service workers. The promises you keep to yourself when breaking them would be convenient and unnoticed. The quality you maintain in work that no one will inspect. These moments, meaningless to most people, are the bedrock upon which intimidating character is built. Each moment of integrity when integrity is difficult. Each act of honor when honor is costly. Each choice of excellence when mediocrity would suffice. These are the stones from which your fortress is constructed. Machiavelli observed that the strongest rulers were those whose private conduct aligned perfectly with their public persona. They did not need to remember what mask to wear because they had no masks. Their character was integrated, consistent, and therefore intimidating in its authenticity. When you encounter someone whose private standards are higher than their public displays, you are meeting someone whose character has achieved fortress-like strength. The intimidating character possesses what Machiavelli called moral flexibility, not the abandonment of principles, but the wisdom to apply them effectively across varying circumstances. The weak man is rigid in small things and flexible in important things. The intimidating character is flexible in tactics while remaining absolutely rigid in core principles. This creates a fascinating paradox for those who try to predict or manipulate such a person. They can count on certain absolute standards but cannot predict the exact form that adherence to those standards will take. Consider how this applies to honesty. The weak man tells the truth when it is convenient and lies when truth is difficult. The intimidating character commits to absolute honesty but applies it with strategic wisdom, knowing when silence is more honest than speech, when directness serves truth better than diplomacy, when brutal honesty is required, and when gentle honesty is sufficient. The commitment to truth remains unshakable, but its application demonstrates the intelligence that makes character intimidating rather than merely stubborn. The fortress of character requires multiple defensive systems, each serving a specific purpose. The outer walls are your public standards, the behaviors and commitments that others can observe and rely upon. These must be maintained flawlessly because any crack in your public character creates doubt about what lies beneath. But the inner keep, your private standards, must be even stronger, for this is where the real battles are fought and won. The most sophisticated aspect of intimidating character is its offensive capability. True character is not merely defensive, it shapes the environment around it. When you encounter someone whose character has been forged into a truly intimidating instrument, you find that conversations become more honest, standards rise naturally, and people begin to examine their own conduct more carefully. This is not because such a person judges or criticizes, but because excellence calls forth excellence, and authentic character makes authenticity in others more likely. Machiavelli understood that reputation and character, while related, are distinct. Reputation is what others think of you. Character is what you actually are. The intimidating character focuses on what he actually is, knowing that reputation will eventually align with reality. This creates enormous freedom. You are not enslaved to the management of perception because your reality is strong enough to eventually shape perception rather than being shaped by it. The development of unassailable character requires what Machiavelli called the cultivation of virtue, excellence in all things that matter. This is not perfectionism, which focuses on avoiding mistakes, but excellence, which focuses on maximizing effectiveness. The intimidating character does not fear making mistakes but ensures that any mistakes are made in pursuit of worthy objectives and are quickly identified, analyzed, and corrected. This brings us to one of the most subtle aspects of intimidating character, the integration of power and restraint. The truly intimidating character possesses the capability for great force but exercises it with precision and proportion. Others sense both the capacity and the restraint, and this combination creates a unique form of respect. They know you could destroy them through superior preparation, through deeper understanding, through more disciplined execution, but they also know you will not do so unless they force the issue through their own actions. The fortress of character must also be designed to handle siege warfare, the prolonged attacks that come not in moments of obvious challenge, but through the slow erosion of time, comfort, and social pressure. The intimidating character maintains its strength not just during crises, but through the mundane years when maintaining standards seems less important. This consistency across time and circumstance is perhaps the most intimidating aspect of all, for it suggests a depth of discipline that most people cannot fathom. The final element of unassailable character is what Machiavelli recognized in the greatest leaders: the ability to bear the weight of others' expectations without being crushed by them. When your character has been forged to intimidating strength, others will naturally look to you for leadership, for judgment, for stability in uncertain times. The weak man is flattered by such attention and seeks it out. The intimidating character accepts it as a natural consequence of excellence and bears it with grace, neither seeking adulation nor avoiding responsibility. The man whose character has become truly unassailable discovers something unexpected. He no longer needs to intimidate others deliberately because his mere presence accomplishes this naturally. His discipline speaks without words. His standards influence without preaching. His character creates space around him, space for thought, for growth, for excellence. And others either rise to fill that space appropriately or remove themselves from it. This is the culmination of the Machiavellian path to intimidating discipline. The man who has destroyed his weak self completely, forged his will into an unbreakable instrument, and constructed his character into an unassailable fortress becomes something rare and powerful. He becomes someone who cannot be destroyed by others because he has already destroyed everything in himself that could be exploited, manipulated, or broken. The intimidation such a man creates is not the crude fear that comes from threats or displays of force. It is the profound respect that comes from encountering someone who has mastered the most difficult opponent of all, himself. Others recognize immediately that they are dealing with someone who operates from a different level of personal power, someone whose word carries weight because it is backed by absolute discipline, someone whose judgment can be trusted because it is not clouded by the weaknesses that compromise most human decision-making. In the end, Machiavelli's greatest insight was not about the exercise of power over others, but about the prerequisite for all lasting power: complete mastery over oneself. The prince who would rule effectively must first become someone who cannot be ruled by his own impulses, weaknesses, or fears. The man who would inspire intimidating respect must first become someone who respects himself enough to demand excellence in every aspect of his existence. This is the true meaning of intimidating discipline, not the ability to frighten others, but the development of such complete self-mastery that others naturally defer to your judgment, seek your approval, and modify their own behavior in your presence. It is the creation of a presence so authentically powerful that it shapes every interaction, elevates every conversation, and commands respect without demanding it. The path is not easy. It requires the destruction of comfortable mediocrity, the forging of will through deliberate difficulty, and the construction of character through countless small acts of integrity when no one is watching. But for those who complete this work, the rewards are immense. A life of authentic power, meaningful influence, and the deep satisfaction that comes from knowing you have become everything you are capable of becoming. The weak self that you began with, that creature of impulse, excuse, and comfortable mediocrity, will seem like a stranger, a person you barely recognize. In its place stands something formidable, a human being who has conquered himself so completely that he cannot be conquered by others, who has forged his discipline to such a point that it intimidates not through cruelty, but through excellence, and who has built his character into such an unassailable fortress that others approach it with natural reverence. This is Machiavelli's ultimate lesson, written not in The Prince, but in the life he lived after its completion. That true power comes not from dominating others, but from so completely dominating yourself that others recognize your strength and naturally align with it. The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others, not because he is defended by external walls, but because he has become internally unbreakable. In the gathering dusk of history, as we look back across the centuries to that small villa outside Florence, where a disgraced politician transformed himself into an eternal voice of wisdom, we understand that Machiavelli's true masterpiece was not his written works, but his own transformation from defeated exile to intimidating master of human nature. His path remains open to any who would walk it. Destroy what is weak, forge what is strong, and build what cannot be broken. The fortress of character awaits construction, and the tools, discipline, will, and uncompromising standards lie ready to hand.